really uses VRAM? What's using our VRAM, Tim? Get to the bottom of it. There are multiple modern games with subpar textures despite using 12 plus gigabytes of VRAM. Okay. While some older games have high resolution, high quality textures, but they use way less. I don't know. I guess we would have needed specific examples, but that hasn't been my general experience personally looking, because I do look quite closely at this stuff. Generally, the games with nicer, higher quality looking textures do use more VRAM, and the games, like we saw with Black Myth Wukong, spectacular looking game, great level of detail, but if you look a bit too closely to things like, rock textures and whatever, they do look very dated. Like similar to Star Wars Battlefront, those type of the older games that had for the time photorealistic textures, and they've aged really well. I've used that example a few times because I think it's a really good example. But
yeah, I think it's maybe part of that question is kind of the nostalgia angle of things. Like, I think if you did a direct comparison between 12 gigabyte or more VRAM consuming games today with some of the best textures compared to games from, let's say, a decade ago that used less than 8 gigabytes, you would see that the modern game does look significantly better in terms of its texture quality. But you might just have recalled that when you played a game from a decade ago that the texture quality was really good because you thought, oh, well, I go back to a game like The Witcher 3, which, at the time I thought was an amazing looking game. And the graphics, I'm blown away by the quality of the graphics. And then obviously games today look a lot better than The Witcher 3, but you've got in your mind when you played it that it looked amazing. So you're kind of comparing today's amazing games to what you thought was an amazing game, but then you actually do a side-by-side comparison and The Witcher 3 does look quite dated. So that's probably playing into that a little bit with maybe your recollection of what texture quality looked like. But on top of that, I think as games, other aspects to visuals improve over time. So like how much stuff is in the game, or the geometry quality, the draw distances and things like that, and the quality of the lighting, it makes things like texture quality stand out more when it's poor. So if you go back a decade ago when all of those aspects were worse, then having equivalent sort of texture quality doesn't stand out as much because the whole visual aspect of the game is sort of that era. Whereas, today, like a Black Myth Wukong kind of stands out a bit more because you've got path trace lighting, you've got these incredible dense world designs, and if you pair that with texture quality from a while back, you sort of notice it more. Sort of you're looking around, you're sort of spotting what are the flaws in this game. Well, it's not the lighting quality and the geometry and the textures like you would see from a game 10 years ago. It's really, you just look at the textures. So I think that plays into it a bit. But VRAM is used for many things that aren't just textures, and it's also the way that games can implement textures has differed over the years. So earlier you would see single layer textures. It's just there's geometry and it's got a texture, that is the texture. Whereas today in games, you'll often see multi-layer textures where game developers will try and put different layers on top of the textures, and each of those things will use more and more VRAM. And I think a great example of this that I was looking at is a game like Dead Space, where there might be a pole that's got like blood or gore on it or something like that, and that will have multiple different surface interactions, multiple different textures. The pole itself, which will have a metal finish, then you'll have the blood, which has a more liquidy finish, and dirt and grime will have its own finish. And it's a little detail that you probably wouldn't notice if you were just playing the game normally. You might just think that was one solid texture. But if you look closely, it appears to be more of this multi-layer design, which is something that developers have talked about wanting to do more of in games, but with VRAM limitations, you can't necessarily do that. And then on top of that, things like the BV8 structure for ray tracing needs to go into VRAM. Modern features like upscaling and frame generation. Because of the way it needs to store and buffer each frame and these high quality, uncompressed frames stored somewhere, you got to put that in the VRAM. That uses up a fair bit of space. And things like geometry as well. The more dense game worlds are trying to be, the more dynamic things are trying to be, the less copies you have of textures across the game world. So each rock has its own individual texture or some generation of a texture that looks slightly different to all the other rocks. Again, if you go back a decade ago, you will see many more repeated textures and repeated elements across game worlds. Even things like you go back to old Grand Theft Auto games, and how often was it where if you see one car in the world, it's likely you'll see many more of those cars, and then some car variants there'll just be none of in that area because the game has decided we've only got so much VRAM to store cars, so we'll have of the 100 cards we're loading in, we'll make them all 5 or 6 variants instead of 20 different variants, because that, again, the more differences that you've got in the scene, the more VRAM that uses. So yeah, we're sort of approaching things you might not notice as much compared to older games, again, where things are much more simple and just including high resolution textures across the board will look good. But yeah, today there's so many different things that utilize VRAM. And it was even funny, I was having a briefing with NVIDIA where they were talking about their upcoming in-game AI models that run locally on GeForce GPUs. Forget the name, sorry, NVIDIA. It looked kind of cool, but it was, you might have seen their, was it ACE technology, which is run in the cloud where you interact with NPCs. It does, voice-to-speech recognition and neural networks to have these NPCs respond naturally. They've got a local version of this that they're implementing. I think some games are doing it in a very light way soon. But basically, I was asking NVIDIA, like, what's the limiting factor on this? Like, what GPUs can use this feature? And they're basically like, well, so long as you've got the right amount of VRAM, this feature will work. Like, enabling this in the game will probably use about 2 gigabytes of VRAM. And that's in addition to all the other stuff that the game's trying to do. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. Maybe your cards should have come with a bit more VRAM if you're implementing more VRAM heavy features. But as we get more into that era of gaming, you will see VRAM becoming more important for those features. So I think textures is kind of like, it's the easy thing to talk about because it has a visual difference and you can modify VRAM usage quite heavily in games by turning down textures. But in modern games, it's many things: texture quality, layering of textures, the variety of things, the geometry, upscaling, frame generation, ray tracing, potential AI features in the future. They're all VRAM heavy things. So yeah, VRAM is important and it goes into many things in games today.